for joining us today for our event, Who Will Fight for the First Amendment, Protecting Free Expression at a Critical Time. We're so pleased to have you here in person and to the many people who are joining us on the live stream in the webinar format. And we're particularly honored to be joined by our distinguished guests today, FCC Commissioner Ana Gomez, Alex Abdo, the Litigation Director at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University, Kate Tummarello, who's the Executive Director at Engine, a policy coalition representing startups and entrepreneurs, and Professor Sarah Oates, who's Associate Dean for Research at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. For those of you who don't know CDT, we're a nonprofit organization that has worked for 30 years to protect people's rights and our democracy in the digital age. Since the earliest days of the internet, we have fought for the First Amendment, for people's right to express themselves, to find community, and to access information online, free from government interference. We're convening this event today because the US is facing a crisis for the future of free speech. When President Trump took office, he issued an executive order entitled Restoring Free Speech. But since that time, his administration has taken action after action that runs directly counter to the First Amendment and to the rule of law. These attacks have taken many forms, from executive orders to deportation threats against people based on their lawful, constitutionally protected expressive activity. Federal agencies have also opened their own fronts in the battle, threatening broadcast licenses based on news outlets' protected editorial choices, considering undermining Section 230 to gain more power over social media platforms, and at the Federal Trade Commission, opening recently a request for information on social media content moderation practices for alleged anti-conservative bias. These efforts come at a time when the independence of federal agencies has been eviscerated by unprecedented attempts to fire commissioners based on nothing more than their perceived political beliefs, and a February executive order aiming to place independent agencies like the FTC and the FCC under direct presidential control. At CDT, we're following these and other attacks closely. We're making the case that these steps and others that we'll discuss today are not only unconstitutional, but disastrous policy choices that harm people's freedom and independent thought across the political spectrum. The speakers joining me today are on the front lines, pushing back against these efforts. So we're grateful to hear from all of them and to invite questions from all of you as to joining us in the room and online. For now, I'll pass to Commissioner Ana Gomez to give some opening remarks, and then we'll turn to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Good afternoon, everyone. And I want to thank also the amazing staff at CDT for organizing and hosting this event. I'm very pleased to kick off my First Amendment tour to challenge government censorship and control at this event and with your great organization. We are in an alarming moment, and I am not someone who is generally alarmist. Since the founding of our country, the First Amendment has protected our fundamental right to speak freely and to hold power to account. Today, the greatest threat to freedom is coming from our own government. As you know, in recent weeks, the FCC has targeted the editorial decisions of news networks, independent reporting by public media, and internal labor practices by companies. These are dangerous and unprecedented actions by the leading government media regulator. You don't have to take my word for it. Groups from every part of the ideological spectrum agree with this assessment. These actions threaten a free and independent press, undermine the First Amendment's free speech protections, and exert undue pressure that compromises the autonomy of private enterprises. More broadly, over the last few months, actions across the federal government have demonstrated a disturbing pattern of silencing dissenting voices. From investigating broadcasters for editorial decisions in their newsrooms, to harassing private companies for their fair hiring practices, to threatening tech companies that respond to consumer demand for fact-checking tools, to trying to control university curricula, to banning unions, targeting law firms, and even targeting the cultural content of the Smithsonian, to firing Senate-confirmed Democratic commissioners of independent agencies. The administration seems intent on targeting anyone who dares to speak up and disagree with its extreme agenda. To me, That's a reflection of the administration's policy of censorship and control. Silencing dissenting voices is not a show of strength. It's a sign of fear. We must continue to speak out against this growing campaign of censorship and control before this dangerous new normal becomes the status quo. I will continue to do so, and I appreciate this esteemed group of panelists that are bringing their varied expertise to this important discussion today. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much. Let's have the panelists come up to join us. Commissioner Gomez, thank you for your opening remarks. You spoke out and named this issue of the reopening of the complaints against some of the broadcasters that engaged in news coverage related to the last election that was deemed as unfavorable to President Trump and now is leading to a newly reopened complaint at the commission. Can you talk a little bit more about that issue and why you view it as so concerning?
Yes, the complaints that that you mentioned were complaints that the last the FCC expert staff dismissed not that long ago for failure to actually state a cause of action, for failure to show that there was a problem. But what the reopening of the complaints say to me is this is actually about bullying and harassing the newsrooms in order to make them think twice before they report the news in a way that this administration doesn't like. So you see that time and time again, where there's complaints about the content of news reporting by whatever station is at issue right then. And it's unprecedented. The FCC is prohibited by statute from censoring broadcasters and from interfering with free speech. The FCC is, of course, also constrained by the First Amendment protections of freedom of speech, freedom of the press. So what we are seeing is a campaign to harass in order to make these broadcasters, these journalists think twice about how they report on this administration. And that is the point. The point is not whether, in fact, we have a good legal ground for taking these actions. It is in order to chill the speech, and you're already seeing it. I have broadcasters tell me privately that they warn their reporters to be careful in how they cover this administration. We just saw the 60 Minutes executive producer resign because he said he cannot be independent anymore. And that's all related to this absolute harassment campaign in order to chill free speech.
And just to build on that, we're seeing a new complaint now recently filed by the Center for American Rights, which brought some of the initial complaints you were just describing, now against news outlets for their coverage of the illegal removal of Kilmar Abrego Garcia to prison in El Salvador. And here again, they're alleging that this is a violation and trying to target the news outlets again. Do you have any initial thoughts on that case?
Yeah, these complaints keep alleging news distortion. Because we do have rules against deliberate falsification or distortion of reporting by broadcasters as part of their public interest obligations. But a public interest obligation does not mean you can't report on anything the administration doesn't like. We can't utilize this public interest standard in an undefined way that then makes any action that may possibly upset one part of the political spectrum a news distortion or something that's actionable by the FCC. And that is what we're saying. What we're seeing, a news distortion complaint requires extrinsic evidence of deliberate distortion or falsification. That is not what we have seen in these reports. It's also a complaint against the networks. And the FCC licensing does not extend. It licenses broadcasters. So it's, again, this is just a campaign to harass in order to chill freedom of the press.
Turning from broadcast media to the social media platforms, you've recently written powerfully about potential attacks on Section 230 and what the appropriate response and thought about that should be. Can you elaborate a little bit on what you're concerned about and what you think needs protection?
Yeah, so Section 230, I know everybody watching this knows about Section 230 and the importance of Section 230 to the internet that we have today. But what I have been speaking about is reports, because the FCC actually hasn't acted in this administration, of efforts to somehow either define Section 230 or to even establish rules pursuant to Section 230 about content moderation, with the goal of, again, trying to control what private actors either put on their allowed to put on their be put on their platforms, or to remove what is objectionable content. So, but my concern, I have several levels of concern. The first is the FCC has no authority to do this. The Section 230 of the Act does not actually instruct the FCC to adopt rules, issue advisory opinions, do anything with Section 230. But on top of that, what you have here is an independent regulator, expert regulator of communications, interfering in private companies' decisions on how they want to set up that private product. Now, that private product may be a conservative-leaning platform that wants to provide a space for conservative-leaning people to communicate in whatever way they want to. That is a protected First Amendment right of that particular company, and the FCC should not be interfering. The platform may be a crocheters group that likes to actually communicate with each other and would really like not to have any harassment as part of whatever community chat group that they have. And that is what Section 230 provides, is the ability for these platforms to provide an environment that is welcoming to whatever community they are trying to sell their product to. And to have the FCC interfering in that private company's right to set that up in order to influence what speech is actually shown on that private platform, I keep saying private, is government interference in free speech. And the Supreme Court has said content moderation is a form of free speech that's protected under our First Amendment. So I think, again, this is another form of the campaign by this administration to censor and control speech.
Kate Tummarello of Engine Advocacy would love to bring you in as our industry voice on the panel. Some speak for the trees, the LARC speaks for the trees, you speak for the startups and the entrepreneurs, and would love to hear your thoughts about kind of Section 230 now and how you think the landscape might evolve and the impact for startups and those in the tech sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And the commissioner did a great job kind of laying out the stakes here. I think something that's often underappreciated, because so often Section 230 conversations are focused on large tech companies. Those protections are critical to startups that host all kinds of user content. We talk about social media a lot. We certainly have social media startups in our network, but we also have startups that host photos or reviews or comment sections, and all of them benefit from Section 230. And most importantly, their users benefit from Section 230. I'm not going to get into the history of Section 230, of course. That could be a different panel and has been. Certainly, we've all sat through those. But I think it's really important to look at kind of like the effect of Section 230 for a startup that hosts content, recognizing that, similar to a lot of the administration's actions, litigation over user speech is a very coercive tool, especially when you're dealing with a startup that has very little resources. Some very quick numbers: the average seed stage startup has about $55,000 a month to cover all of its expenses. Salaries, equipment, customer acquisition, rent for a space, all of that. One lawsuit over user content would wipe that out for months. That's hundreds of thousands of dollars we're talking about. And so Section 230 protects the startup that wants to host the First Amendment protected speech of its users. Maybe, to the commissioner's point, it's a certain community of users, a certain kind of speech, and not have to worry about being dragged to court over something one of its users said. And if you've ever been on the internet, you know people disagree with what should be allowed on platforms. And so you can imagine how quickly those either actual lawsuits or even threats of lawsuits would pop up. And so I think the administration and lawmakers and kind of state lawmakers and everybody threatening to change Section 230, threatening to look into content moderation practices with this stick of changing Section 230 hanging over them, what they're intending to do is that coercive tool. They want to make it harder for platforms to host content unless you host the content they like. And that's very dangerous, especially for startups who do appeal to niche communities and do have very specific uses and don't want to have to host everything and don't want to have to host harassing content or even political content necessarily. So I think the impact here is really, really broad and affects the whole internet, not just kind of the large companies that tend to be the focus.
Staying with you for a minute, I wanted to focus on the FTC Commissioner Chair's recent request for information on anti-conservative censorship, and then kind of other concerns that we're hearing about the level just of pressure coming from the administration about the moderation choices that are happening. A lot of the news stories right now say what's happening for the big companies, but I'm curious just how you see the industry reacting as a whole and what it means to feel that type of pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's not impossible or even difficult to imagine a world where a small platform goes viral or gets news coverage or for some reason ends up on the radar of the wrong folks who have the wrong level of power to coerce certain speech from being hosted or not hosted. And so even if the focus is large companies, I don't think it ends there. I think startups that host content know they could just as easily be in the crosshairs with one wrong headline or one wrong social media post. And so they're taking their cues from everyone else. And if large platforms are capitulating or making changes or settling or whatever it ends up being, the whole industry will have to look at that and make a very difficult business decision. Is it worth fighting this in court or fighting this, right in the regulatory process? Or should we just do what they want so that we can go back to doing what we do, which is build products that people use? And I think that's, again, the focus might be on large companies, but I think everyone's watching.
And I don't think you can talk about these actions without acknowledging the context of what is happening at the agencies that regulate these sectors, right? So the firings at the Federal Trade Commission, the FCC has so far withstood those, but the executive order, nice to see it. The executive order that challenged the independence of the independent agencies and claimed to put them under stronger direct presidential control does apply directly to the FCC. So I'm curious how you interpret that, what it means, and just your overall take on the current environment and extreme politicization in these determinations.
Yeah, and if I could just mention one thing about Section 230 that I do feel like I always get asked this question is or challenged on this. I'm not saying that the internet is in a state of nirvana right now. But imagine if there's no content moderation at all. And secondly, it is up to Congress if they want to change Section 230. It's not up to the FCC to somehow interpret away the protections under Section 230 or from liability. So, all right, independent agency. Congress created the FCC as an independent agency for a reason. They created it to be an expert regulatory body free from political interference. And largely at the time, it was because of broadcasting, because there was fear of having a political influence over what broadcasters could and could not report. The FCC is an independent agency. It is not independent from oversight. It is overseen by Congress, and believe you me, I know that it is overseen by Congress. And Congress writes the laws that we implement, and it can just as much expand our authority or contract it depending on what it determines is the right thing. But it is so important to have us remain independent, because we will lose our standing as a regulator if we are seen as just a political arm of the administration, and if we are seen as a tool weaponizing our licensing authority in order to take actions on behalf of the administration because of their ideology or because of their desire to control and censor free speech. We are also an important agency internationally. We work with our colleagues all over the world, both to promote a free and independent media ecosystem, as well as to do really boring things like get spectrum allocations on the international chart so that we have new and innovative services. But if we are not respected as a stable expert-driven regulatory body, we will lose our standing, much like we're losing our standing already because of the adverse actions we're taking against USAID and our HHS, pulling out of international organizations. All that soft power that we are losing, we will also lose in the reputation of the regulatory agency if we do not remain independent.
I want to take us to another area where we're seeing attacks on the First Amendment. And Alex, that's in the immigration context, where again, we are seeing immigration enforcement now based solely on, again, constitutionally protected expressions of speech. Obviously, at the First Amendment Institute, you've been doing a lot of work on this issue. You're also part of the Columbia University community, which is being directly affected by the attack on Mahmoud Khalil. So I would love to hear your thoughts on how that landscape is unfolding and what you've been doing in the space.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I mean, it's a shocking thing to say that our government is deporting people for their political views. And, in ordinary times, if you were to make a claim like that, you would be expected to come up with extraordinary proof. But right now, what is, it's that's not the challenge. The challenge is not identifying the illegal conduct. It's not, explaining to the public just how it could be that the government is doing this, because it's very plain. The government is claiming credit for it. It's articulating this policy. It's enforcing it. It has been trying to deport a number of students and faculty on the basis of their political speech. And when it has been called upon in court to defend those decisions, it has submitted evidence, that again is these individuals constitutionally protected speech, and that is a shocking state of affairs. And one thing I want to highlight, because this goes to something that the commissioner said earlier, is that the game here is not the underlying claim of authority. The game here is the chill, because the chill is spreading much more quickly than the courts and advocacy groups can keep up. In doing the work that we've done on this issue, and I'll get to that in a second, we've talked to citizens, non-citizens, students and faculty from around the country, and the chill that they feel right now is palpable. They're withdrawing from public life. They are no longer going to the protests that they used to go to. They're no longer engaging in the kind of scholarship that they used to engage in on the question of Israel and Palestine. Students are changing the topics they write about in course. Professors are changing their curricula. Some people have fled, their apartments and their houses for fear of getting a visit by ICE to pick them up because they happen to say the wrong thing in the views of this administration. The challenge is, how do we address that chill? Because the litigation is ongoing right now. There are any number of cases being litigated challenging the legality of the administration's policy of targeting these students and faculty. But it'll take a long time, I think, before we can secure rulings from the Supreme Court that stop it. And in the meantime, these people's lives are affected. So what we're doing at the Knight Institute most directly is we're litigating a challenge on behalf of the American Association of University Professors and the Middle East Studies Association, which are two faculty groups whose members have been affected dramatically by the attempts to deport their non-citizen members, their non-citizen student and faculty members. And we actually just had a hearing in federal court yesterday in Boston. And so I'm very familiar now with the Amtrak route from, we're hopeful that courts will eventually step in. But again, in so many of these areas across the full assault that we're seeing on First Amendment freedoms, the goal here by the administration, I don't think, is to defend its policies in court, because it just can't. Its policies are very clearly unlawful. The goal is to chill, and it's been very effective in accomplishing that chill.
Are there more steps that you wish the universities were taking in this moment?
I wish the universities were the ones who had filed these suits. I think it is a stain on the reputation of these universities that it has taken faculty membership associations and the students themselves to stand up for their rights. It should be, should have been the universities from the very beginning. But I think the universities made a misstep at the very beginning, which was to characterize the vast majority of the students on their campus as engaged in either unlawful or rabidly anti-Semitic speech, when I just don't think that was the case. I can speak for Columbia, where I am. On Columbia's campus, was there anti-Semitism? Absolutely. But the vast majority of the protests that took place were not anti-Semitic. They were peaceful political protests, and people can disagree about the message of the protesters, but many of the universities distanced themselves from the outset from their students, and that put them in a very uncomfortable position when the administration came for them, because they felt an obligation to acknowledge wrong, confess error, which put them in a bind under Title VI, which is the law that forbids discrimination in federally funded programs like universities. And so, it's been challenging, I think, for the students and the faculty who would otherwise, in normal circumstances, want to rely on the universities to stand up for them when they are, by and large, not.
Sarah, Columbia's obviously been in the news, but there are universities around the country where some of these dynamics are playing out. And I'm curious your impression from being at UMD.
So it is true that some universities are much more in the spotlight than others, but I think we all share the concerns that Alex has talked about. And this is a huge topic of discussion and debate. And you see, although I agree with you, I would like to see universities do more where they can. I also happen to be a university administrator, so I'm also aware of some constraints. We did have, an issue at the University of Maryland where a pro-Gaza group wanted to have, a memorial demonstration, and the university wound up saying they couldn't, and it went to the courts, and then it was allowed. And that there were 2 protests that day, on each side of the issue, and it passed off peacefully. So navigating these issues in this environment takes a lot of careful time and thought on the part of universities. There's some sort of, you're always going to get angry phone calls from both sides and a lot of concern. That being said, okay, the University of Maryland is both physically huge, unlike Columbia, which sounds somewhat irrelevant, but it also means that many things happen on campus that are not necessarily going to coalesce into one central area. So part of it's physical. I would say amongst the students and the faculty who, despite what the Trump administration may say, have a wide range of ideological viewpoints and ways of looking at the world, there is a deep and rising well of anger at the attacks on academic institutions who have always viewed themselves as doing a lot of good in the world, as being kind of on the side of the angels, right? So today in our faculty senate, I know they're voting on whether to join the Big Ten resolution of mutual aid on attacks on universities. So I've been an academic and been a little long-winded, so I'll stop now.
No, it's helpful to hear. Alex, I want to come back to you for another immigration related issue, which is the recent announcement by USCIS about their use of social media monitoring as a tool for screening visa applicants and entrants into the United States. For those who are interested, CDT has written about this for years, including some of the technical ways in which it's done and the error rates and concerns with this, just as a matter of validity. But of course, there are massive free expression implications as well. I'm curious your take on that issue and anything you'd like to share.
Yeah, it's another attempt to chill constitutionally protected speech. I think there are 2 key problems with this effort. And, for those who haven't been following, the government has announced that it is going to use automated tools to monitor social media in an effort to identify non-citizen students and faculty who are, quote unquote, anti-Semitic and for potential deportation or denial of entry to the country. And we know, from many of the government statements that it treats a wide swath of speech as anti-Semitic. Virtually any expression of support for Palestinians or criticism of Israel, this administration seems to treat as anti-Semitic. But one key problem is that the premise here is wrong. The government shouldn't be pointing to constitutionally protected speech as a basis for enforcing the immigration laws. Non-citizens who are resident in the country have First Amendment rights. The Supreme Court said that as early as 1945 in a case called Briggs. And it is just not a legitimate basis for deporting somebody, the fact that they happen to hold a particular political view. And today it's anti-Semitism, but tomorrow it could be support for Ukraine. It could be exactly support for abortion rights, or, in another administration armed with the authority that this administration is claiming, it could be any political view under the sun. The second problem, though, with the policy is that even if you thought it were legitimate for the government to target non-citizens on the basis of pro-Palestinian or anti-Semitic speech, using social media monitoring as a tool for identifying that speech is deeply flawed. The error rates, as CDT has pointed out, are very, very high because it's very hard to understand context online without a human involved. And even when humans are involved, it's very hard to understand context when you're not the person in the conversation. You don't know, the meanings that people are intending. So again, I think in some ways, I think what the administration would like is for us to focus on the merits of these policies, but the goal again is the chill. The policies will be on the books not for too long, I hope, but the chill will outlast and in the meantime do significant damage.
A mild PSA to folks in the audience. We want to include your questions, both from folks who are online and all of you who are in the room. If you're online, you can email questions to events@cdt.org. Is that the right? No, press@cdt.org, excuse me. Either, you'll reach the same person either way. It's a little behind the curtain. The Wizard of Oz is just a small man. And for those of you in the room, we have note cards, so please pass them over or you'll be able to raise your hand. Sarah, I want to come to you and focus on your experience, not just as a member of the administration, but also your academic scholarship. Yes.
The university administration.
Excuse us. But of course, your actual, your research and your scholarship. So you've studied Russian disinformation campaigns and more broadly, the tactics used by authoritarian regimes to shape public discourse and maintain power. And I'm curious how that scholarship is reading on the current moment, the things that you look out for when you think about how a free society engages in expression and accessing information.
Right. So I'll try to be concise. So the big picture is where Russian disinformation and the current administration meet is in their desire to take away the notion of fact-based reality, right? So in Trump's first term, he didn't get as many people at his inaugurations. Obama did, but he said he did. And when it was pointed out to him that that was factually inaccurate, he said, well, his spokesperson said, well, that's alternative facts, right? So why do you want to do that? So if you decouple truth from reality, if you tell people that facts don't matter and convince them that the narrative of make America great again, bring the factories back, build a wall, throw out the immigrants, if you can, then no one, if you've ever tried to argue with someone who truly believes some of these false narratives, it's impossible, right? So that's what you want. And I think Putin's been very successful at that. I think the Trump administration mirrors that particular approach to disinformation. More specifically, what to expect when you're expecting authoritarianism, he does it a little bit differently. I would say in Russia, it was more about passing new laws. It was more about violence and even execution of journalists. And that had a very chilling, speaking of chilling effects, that had a very chilling effect. Here, it's more this sort of shock and awe with illegal executive orders that are trying to intimidate people. On a final note, I would say, I think it's very hard to intimidate American journalists. And that is something that is going to be a big challenge for the Trump administration.
It's no secret that one of the efforts we've seen unfolding in recent months is actually an attack on the field of mis and disinformation research in general. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that, what you're seeing, what the consequences are.
So we saw, I think it was just last week, that the National, I believe it was the National Science Foundation, the NSF, rescinded and canceled all grants with mis and disinformation. That's very important work that's being done not only for helping people to navigate a world where just because of the openness of our media system, you're going to encounter a lot of disinformation pushed at you for profit or for political means. But our foreign adversaries are just besides themselves with glee. We have created an environment in which, in particular, Russian and Chinese propaganda can flood our system and is already affecting some of our news narratives. So it's both a domestic problem and I look at it more from the international view.
Commissioner Gomez.
Yeah, I was going to say a couple of things. First of all, the attack on content moderation is largely about eliminating fact checking. And you see, again, an administration-wide campaign against what they call the censorship cartel, which they consider to be anyone that wants fact checking or that does fact checking themselves, as being not consistent with the protections from liability that Section 230 provides. I disagree with that. There's a lot of scholars that disagree with that, but number one. So that's part of the attacks on facts. Secondly, this also highlights the importance of journalism and the importance in particular of local broadcasters, because you need organizations that have journalistic ethics, that are going to provide fact-based reporting. And our consumption of media is getting more and more fractured and gravitating toward what we want to hear and not what we need to hear. And that is so dangerous, particularly at the local level, because we need civic engagement. We need people to have information that is specific to whatever their communities are, and not to be given Chinese misinformation that sounds very believable and usually is pretty outrageous, which feeds our need for outrage. So it's really important that we continue to support our local broadcasters and our journalists and our local newspapers, because they are such an important bulwark against this type of mis and disinformation and alternative facts. Finally, I would just say they shuttered the Voice of America. I know we had a good court decision on that, but that right there is closing down a really, really important avenue for getting good journalistic, gold standard reporting all over the world.
And I think two more threat vectors that we're watching on a related front. So in addition to the cancellation of research dollars funding the field of mis and disinformation, the folks in government that were literally looking out for signals intelligence of foreign malign influence, those teams have also been fired and shuttered with very minimal oversight, accountability, or even visibility into who's been terminated and why. And then in a related note, the researchers that have been doing this work for a long time, losing grants is the latest in many years of attacks and a very political campaign that has led to lawsuits, congressional oversight hearings, all under the guise that the study of mis and disinformation was somehow leading to online censorship, as opposed to this notion that actually understanding how information travels on the internet is an essential component to make sure that our society is ready for the dynamics of the new information age.
Yeah, I just wonder if they read any of this research, because I read a great deal of it. And the other point is, good luck stopping this research. It is, it's the most engaged and engaging research in my field, and there's a lot going on. It will continue to go on.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll turn to the audience. So keep emailing in, and then folks here, get ready to raise your hands. Axios has had some recent reporting, Alex, that members of the Trump administration are considering further ways to put those who are in disagreement with the administration in jeopardy, including even, and reading this felt surreal, charging them with crimes, alleging that they're aiding and abetting terrorism. Is that truly possible for them to do? What are the legal constraints on that power? And we'll start with you, but then would welcome others to chime in if you'd like to on this issue.
Yeah, that the First Amendment poses a pretty high barrier to accusing somebody of being engaged in terrorism through speech. And the Supreme Court has actually spoken on this question before. And essentially the line is the government needs to demonstrate that you are providing material support in coordination with a terrorist group. And in this example and in so many others, I think what the administration is trying to do is to use the language of the law to come up with a standard that seems as though it is plausibly constitutional. But we know that they will interpret much more broadly to sweep in a lot of constitutionally protected speech, again, to create a chill on constitutionally protected expression. I think that's what's going on in this case, and it's what's going on in so many of the executive orders, where you see words that seem designed to make the First Amendment challenge a little bit harder, but where the executive orders are interpreted by agency officials and enforced by agency officials in a way that quite clearly is meant to, again, punish speech the government doesn't like.
Just to give a really specific example of that, one of the executive orders was a March one targeting the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. Folks in this room in our field know about this program. It's how you, get forgiveness on your loans after doing years of government service or working in the public interest. And the executive order very specifically uses the language you just described, which is that you may lose your eligibility if you are found aiding and abetting terrorist activity, but also illegal immigration, trans rights, they phrase it differently in that executive order, or illegal discrimination, which we know in this environment could easily mean broader work on DEI or equity issues. And so for those of you who are kind of wondering, what does this look like and how might the threat continue to manifest? I think that the language in that executive order of how they describe the categories of people who would not be eligible, you can easily see as a continuation for the threat landscape going forward. Curious if others have thoughts on this piece of the landscape.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned diversity, equity, and inclusion, because one of the things that one of the first actions that were taken under this administration was the executive order on eliminating diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the first this first action, I think, official action that the FCC took was to eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at the FCC. And I see diversity, equity, and inclusion as very much being part of freedom of speech, freedom of association. But also part of the problem, and this is the same problem with the actions against the broadcasters, is there really is no definition of what is diversity, equity, and inclusion discrimination. So anything that is remotely tied to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or race, gender, disability, and other protected categories is obviously invidious. I always want to say indivisible discrimination, invidious discrimination. So again, it's all about the harassment and about getting parties to capitulate before there's any kind of a challenge about the legality of government action against these practices, both within the government and by private actors. And you're seeing it. The capitulation is immediate because, especially at the FCC, parties want something from the FCC. And if the corporate overseers decide it is not worth them continuing a practice, is it actually a good business practice? Let's make that clear. DEI is not discrimination. DEI is about fairness. It's about inclusivity. It's about having both a work environment that attracts the best talent and also about having the best product that serves the communities that want to use your product. That is what diversity, equity, and inclusion is about. But again, much like the actions, the claims of illegality are what get parties to capitulate before there's even a discussion about what the standard is. And if you're going to do that, you really have an obligation to develop a standard that tells parties what it is that they need to do in order not to violate supposedly the law.
Our first online question before I turn to the room is exactly on this topic, but Kate, it's for you as the industry perspective. The question is, how can companies uphold human rights values and protect their users at this critical time?
Yeah.
No pressure.
That's the end. I'm about to lay out a roadmap that will change the world. I mean, I think for startups, right, because that's who we work with, they're really clear in their vision. They're really clear in their mission. They know what they're setting out to do. They know the users they're setting out to serve. And I think staying true to that is more important. I mean, right, we saw after the inauguration, Meta changed course on its content moderation policies. And I would caution, and I do caution all the startups we work with, don't follow that lead. I think a lot of startups, can rest assured that they're not first under the gun when the administration's cranking up the heat. But they do look to those who are and try to figure out what to do. The users, right, are always going to be the guiding mission. Startups are they have no users when they start. They're starting, and they will live and die by the success of their user acquisition and retention programs, which means creating a product people want to use and keeping that product, right? And they'll maybe pivot and fine tune. And I'm not saying you should stick with a product that people don't want, but once you've attracted your community of users, that has to be the bellwether. The what do they need, and that means not changing on a whim just because the administration has changed its mind or because you're getting pressure from one politician or another. That's really difficult, all points out, is making about chilling effect. But I think recognizing that they have to be true to their users, which is going to be different in every case, right? There should be platforms that I don't want to be on, and there should be platforms I do want to be on, and that can be different, and that's important. But as long as the companies are really being guided by what their users want, I think that's a better way to chart a course than trying to avoid upsetting the wrong politician.
Let's pass to questions in the room before I go back to online ones. If you do raise hands and if you say who you are, where you're from, and then since they are unmiked, if you can repeat the questions as you answer, please.
Hey, I'm John Bergmeyer from Public College. I guess wonder if people could comment on the difficulty of defending the First Amendment rights of media companies in particular that don't seem to want to defend themselves. I mean, if you have companies just like rolling over to rent a car and just like not really fighting back in any substantial way, what am I to do? Basically.
So this is legal strategies for defending the First Amendment rights of companies who may not be defending their rights themselves.
Yes, this is what I mean about the use of the licensing authority in order to censor and control. And it's truly about the chilling effect and not really about the outcome of any particular proceeding or enforcement. And when you have companies that have business before the FCC that involves billions of dollars, they are going to look at this in terms of how they meet their shareholder needs and how they can get their transaction done. And therefore you see capitulation. We're already seeing capitulation. And the problem with capitulation is it engenders capitulation. Dina, my chief of staff, likes to tell me freedom isn't free. Our democracy is at risk here. We have soldiers who have died for our freedom and our democracy. It is incumbent on everyone to defend our constitutional values and our democracy. So I would like to see more courage throughout the United States because everyone is being targeted. And to stand up, because the way you stand up to a bully is you push back.
I'd like to add to that because I had the exact same reaction as you in terms of going, why is this rich media company that has the ability and could have an excellent defense, right? Under the First Amendment or anything. I think when we look back on this period in history, I really hope we reach a turning point where people will learn from our mistakes and push back. And I think Colombia might do things differently if this were to happen again. But I have a lot of sympathy for an extraordinary situation in which mistakes were made. So I would like to see more of a dialogue that has more class solidarity across the media outlets and across universities.
Can I add to that? Because I absolutely agree with that. And I think the strategy we're seeing is a strategy of divide and conquer. And it has largely worked for the administration because no one university, no one law firm, no one media organization feels as though it has the political clout, the finances, to stand up to the administration. And, one of the challenges for any of these organizations individually is that even if you beat the claim being brought against you, even if you beat the particular legal assaults, there's so many other levers that the administration can pull in trying to make your life difficult. And what this administration has shown is a lawless willingness to pull every single lever at its disposal. And I think the only, hope we have in pushing back is building coalitions, building united fronts, and hoping that at some point the spell breaks, that it becomes apparent to organizations, to universities that they can push back, and that while they may risk existential threats, it's worth it at the end of the day, and there's no real alternative. Because we have seen those that have capitulated, the threat hasn't gone away, the government comes back and they keep dipping in the well. Yeah. And, I think the more everybody comes to understand that reality, that capitulation is not the solution, I think they'll be driven to, hopefully courage. And, as just the flip side of the coin from the commissioner, capitulation is contagious, but I hope courage is too. And that I think has to be our hope.
Ash.
Sorry, Vanderbilt. Thank you so much for the panel. My question is, the courts seem to be the medium we've all turned to as we digest everything that's going on. What are other ways we can address them? Maybe state legislatures while we still have federalism, or any other ideas you might have?
So this is strategies other than the courts, for example, turning to the states.
Well, I would say that journalists are still speaking truth to power. And where there's some perhaps chilling effect, and the 60 Minutes producer exit is very concerning. I would say that this is pushing journalists to be bolder in some ways. I mean, we always talk about how the Trump administration treats journalists in a different way, but I also think that journalists are also abandoning some guardrails and saying that I think, this is so funny because we were laughing about Marylanders always promoting their state in kind of an interesting way. But I think Maryland has had some pushback in some legislation.
I would just say, as a former reporter, I do think the role of journalism is so important, and especially, you know, independent and local and not traditional. I don't want to say not mainstream, because what does that even mean? But I don't mean like commentators on TikTok, but people who write, who what they do is research and report. I think that's going to be increasingly important.
I would say support civic institutions. And at the end of the day, it's about votes. It's about political organizing. Law is one means of slowing down political power, but the source itself is where we all have to turn. I think at the end, it's about getting votes and making sure that politicians who facilitate these authoritarian moves aren't around the next time.
I think you had a really good point about this when we were talking before, and saying that one of the most important things, I think everyone in this room is probably aware of the issues and concerned about the issues, but how do we reach the people not in the room, right? So I think you had one of the really important ways is to think of ways to enlighten people that, well, it may seem like their team is winning, overall you're losing because you're losing fundamental rights.
That's a great point. Other questions, please.
Yeah, Casey picked Trevor Project. Thinking about the challenge of does the public care about free speech, First Amendment rights, especially in a moment where it seems like so many of the trusted messengers are directly under assault. Academia, journalism, science, nonprofit organizations. If they've done a good job discrediting all the trusted messengers, then how do we reach the public to make them care about free speech?
An important and devastating question, but how does, which for our online audience, the summary is how do we make sure the public cares about free speech, particularly when the trusted messengers have been so wholly discredited? What's the path back?
I mean, this is me speaking as a person who consumes internet content. This is not like an engine position, but I was really shocked in a good way about the kind of online response to the TikTok roller coaster of a ban, no ban. And I think, that conversation didn't necessarily reflect the policy conversation that happened that led to the TikTok ban, but what people took away from it was like, how dare you remove my ability to speak freely? And so I don't actually think people are like, don't care about free speech. I think maybe it's more the dot connecting that we do and try to do, and lots of us can do, of how this is an attack on free speech. I do think people fundamentally care about the ability to communicate. And right, that's why I would argue Section 230 is so important, so we can have those communications online and you can reach those people who maybe aren't tuning into this panel. But I think people care, and it's more about how we build the case of how to pay attention.
Commissioner, what's your take on this?
Well, this is why I'm embarking on a tour to talk about this administration's efforts to censor and control, because we need people to understand what's happening and we need them to speak out. So keep talking about it, keep helping, and keep up the civic engagement. That is what really worries me, is that there is an effort through censorship and control to actually also stop civic awareness and engagement.
I'm going to squeeze in 2 online questions and then we'll come back to the room. But one is on that theme and the types of thing that make civic engagement hard. Alex, I'm going to come to you first on this one, but others might chime in. This is from a researcher who was doxxed by Elon Musk for their algorithmic accountability work. And they're asking, what are our privacy and free expression rights as citizens to exercise our right to free speech and assembly?
It's, so one of the real challenges, and this came up during the protests at Columbia and elsewhere, is what the role of the First Amendment is when it comes to doxing. And it turns out the First Amendment provides broad protections to speech, including a lot of what people think of as doxing. Not everything, but including a lot of that. And so, I don't know that the law is going to provide much of an adequate remedy when it comes to a lot of what people think of as doxing, unfortunately, because of the First Amendment. But there are privacy rules that can have real effect. There are limitations on the ability of people to uncover private information about you and spread it maliciously. But it is one of the challenging, gaps in legal protection, or you might think of as strength of the First Amendment, depending on your perspective.
I think it illuminates one of the tensions we deal with all the time at CDT, which is, of course, the First Amendment creates limitations on what you can do for very good reason, and we are fierce defenders of those laws. It doesn't mean that companies shouldn't have some responsible practices in place, and we're not going to encourage them in the marketplace of ideas by really urging them to do so in those types of instances. So again, a room for content moderation and for companies kind of having thoughtful policies on that. The next question is coming back to you, Commissioner. To what extent did the FCC's current fixation on censoring critics, impairing or preventing it from addressing crucial issues such as the Spectrum Pipeline, Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, the USF crisis? It's basically your entire agenda is written on this card. I don't know if this was a plan, but it is a very good question about how you're actually seeing the FCC spending its time right now.
That is such a great question, and I want to thank you, whoever it was that sent that in. Yes, I mean, I would really like to see the FCC pivot away from the culture wars and from censorship and control and pivot toward our core mission. And I will talk about our core mission. Our core mission is to ensure that everyone is connected to affordable broadband. How boring. It's such a wonderful, boring, but crucial thing for our GDP and for everyone in our country to participate in our digital age. We need to pivot away from censorship and control and from the culture wars in order to ensure public safety has what it needs to do its job during times of disaster, during every time that they help us in our public safety, to ensure communities have the information they need during times of emergencies, to find the resources and to promote the resources that our innovators need in order to provide products, cool products like wireless mics.
A little shade at the end. Here, but a lowly nonprofit, dedicating our resources to the daily work.
But seriously, radars in cars that will tell parents when they left their child in the back seat. Yeah. There's a lot of really important satellites that are now providing broadband internet. There's a lot of innovative services that the FCC enables through its actions. Consumer protection. We protect consumers against fraudulent practices. Who hates robocalls?
The entire room has their hand up for those online.
We focus so much on robocalls. We need to go back to that because we are spending our time doing the bidding of this administration to censorship and control. And instead, we should be focusing on our core mission. So thank you to whoever asked that question.
Back to the room, please.
David and Sarah, one play a little bit of devil's advocate on when we're working on defining and researching this information, we're often dealing with somewhat subjective, sometimes politically controversial definitions. Is government funding of potentially subjective subject matter, do you have any risk that undermines or muddies the legitimacy in the work of that because the government is funding it and occasionally gets it wrong? Are we worried about the legitimacy of institutions when they take on that role when they're funded by government?
So a thoughtful question from the audience about, given the subjectivity of concepts of misinformation, is it appropriate for the government to be funding it? And are there ways in which that can compromise the research or compromise what the government is doing?
I would say that facts are facts, right? And I would say that I don't find it helpful to talk about whether something's misinformation or disinformation, right? Because that's in the mind of the person, and I'm not concerned about that. What I think is important to research is both supporting the institution of fact-based journalism and also researching how that is deliberately undermined for political reasons and for profit, right? And I think that that's a really important type of research that we need to do to keep, and you called it an ecosystem, to keep our media ecosystem healthy. And I've done content analysis for 30 years, right? And I've long since thrown out the notion of left, right, negative, positive. What I'm interested in is how information is traveling through these systems and whether it's based on fact or not, and how that helps citizens. So I hope that answers, it's a little bit of an academic answer, I freely admit, but I hope that helps.
Yeah, just even an even broader answer, I think the government has an important role to play in funding basic scientific research, and it has done that for decades and decades. And today's research on the flows of information online is, that's the new area of study, because in many ways, algorithmic decision-making has become the new physics of the way that information flows, and we don't understand that physics. And today's, researchers are focusing on trying to understand that research. Often it's under the umbrella of this phrase, which I am with you. It is an awkward phrase, mis and disinformation research. But I think at the end of the day, it's largely basic scientific research into how information and ideas flow online. In the analog world, we know how they flow online. They flow through radio waves, print media, and the like. We can see, or at least detect, those flows of information, but we don't have those same kinds of sensors when it comes to the new physics of social media. So that research seems to me extraordinarily important. That is not to say that the government has a role in coercing platforms into censoring speech. And there was obviously a big debate during the Biden administration about whether that administration was engaged in that kind of coercive campaign. But I think, if maybe pulling back even a little more, a lot of what I think underlies people's discomfort with the internet, and, this is to the commissioner's point about you don't have to think that the current internet is a nirvana. A lot of what underlies the discomfort, I think, is a concern over centralized control over speech. And if anything animates the First Amendment, that's the principle, is that we shouldn't have centralized control over speech, whether it's the government or large, powerful private corporations. That's my view anyway. And I think it'd be nice to sell to people, to pitch them on an alternative vision for what our internet could look like, where it is not dominated by a handful of large companies, where there is a meaningful role for competition policy and antitrust work to make sure that we're not all subject to the whims of three people's views on content moderation. But instead could sign up for all of the exciting services that Kate is helping come into existence. That's what I would like to, that's an alternative that I think might be appealing to people who are, for reasons that I understand, uncomfortable with what the internet looked like, has looked like for the past few years.
Can I just add, and I think Section 230 is a key part of making it so that anybody can start a platform and engage in hosting or not hosting the First Amendment protected speech they want that makes sense for their users. And so I think to get to this world where we have this rich, vibrant online community competition, keeping Section 230, not narrowing it or repealing it or sunsetting it is crucial.
And I know we're at time, so I'll make this very brief. But I also think that this highlights the notion that I don't know whether Obama said that or Bernie Sanders or whoever, but right now it's a little bit harder to be liberal. Like, it was really easy for a long time. And it's really down to users, to the citizens you think this is a toxic platform, don't use it. Get off of it. You're the product. So I think that we're entering an era where people more than ever need to know the levers of control and the consequences for actions of what they do, and their attitudes toward the media.
A good affirmative vision for us to end on and build towards. I want to thank everybody who joined us online. Thanks to all of you for joining us in person, and a special thanks to all of our speakers, both for the thoughtful discussion and the work that you're doing every day. I will say at CDT, we're going to keep up the work. We are going to keep making the case everywhere we can that freedom of speech, freedom of association, ability to access information benefits all of us, no matter your political ideology. And it's something that every single one of us needs to fight for in this moment. So a real thanks to all of you.